Good afternoon. So I was asked to speak about the new evangelization. And so it's a topic that has received more attention in the previous two papacies than in the present papacy. So what I'd like to do is say a little bit about this and then put it in the context of where all of you are, and in a sense, where all of us are at some point in our lives. So let me begin then. And being an academic, I have a text with me. I just have never felt like I can just do off the cuff. So bear with me, but I hope it's enough to at least keep you mostly awake for the next 45 minutes or so. So just about 2 years ago, I attended a dinner in Baltimore with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Doctrine as the president of the Catholic Theological Society from 2012 to 2013. So the head of the committee at that time, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, he had just returned from a synod in Rome on the new evangelization. So that was actually the last synod. The one in the family is going on now. He was so excited about this meeting, and he was very eager to share his enthusiasm with the members of the committee, the other bishops, and a few of us who were members of the presidential line of the Catholic Theological Society and of the College Theology Society. So these are the two major groups of theologians in the U.S. So our waitress came in to take our orders, and she looked around at all of us and she said, "Are you all members of the same religion?" And so, you've got these 8 or 9 bishops and 4 or 5 lay people. And we said, yes. And she said, "Well, what religion is that?" And we said, "Well, we're Catholic." And she said, "Oh, yeah, I was baptized a Catholic, but, I really find God in nature now." And so after she left with our orders, Cardinal Wuerl said, "This is why we need the new evangelization. We have people who think that the church is just filled with rules, and so therefore we need a way of communicating the gospel message better." Now, I think Cardinal Wuerl was right, but the material that was circulating about the new evangelization at the time did not give me great hope that this would bring immediate success. And so one of the things being that bishops and theologians have had somewhat tense relationships, and I'm not sure that we would have been happy collaborators in this process at that time. And I would also note that some of the messages coming from Rome at the time suggested that what the Catholic Church might be in the future was a much smaller organization over and against a hostile secular culture. So this didn't suggest the new evangelization would bring lots of eager supporters. So in short, I think the whole idea of the new evangelization was and is a wonderful idea, but the process of evangelizing, I thought at the time, needed a much better way of communicating the gospel. Now, 4 months later, Pope Francis was elected, and a very different sort of message began to come out from Rome. Rather than the church being understood as a small minority over and against the dangers of culture, Pope Francis suggested that the church was, as you've already heard today, a field hospital, open to all of the wounded of the world, which is all of us. His emphasis on mercy and compassion has superseded the previous emphasis that I would say on doctrinal purity. And just this week, the Pope at the Synod said that those present should feel free to say what they thought and not worry about whether someone would think that they were wrong. And the quote, the English translation was, "without pusillanimity and fear." That word, of course, got the little red underlining in my word program. So my suggestion here today is that we're all being challenged by the Pope to evangelize and to live out the gospel values in all of our work, especially as we are here today in the context of healthcare. So for me as a theologian and teacher, and for you involved in healthcare, we encounter people who are in need of the good news every day. How do we respond to these questions and needs? So what I'd like to do today, and if I had been really well prepared, I would have had all fancy PowerPoints, but you'll just have to deal with me, is first to talk about what has been said by Catholic officials about the new evangelization. So what is it? Why is it needed? What can it do? Second, I want to draw on the ideas of a contemporary philosopher to help us flesh out some of these ideas in new and, I think, refreshing ways. And while this particular philosopher, when I get there, he is not specifically addressing the new evangelization, he's nevertheless outlining what it takes to convey the gospel message in a way that invites response. And then third, inspired by the women religious who have been the main educators and healthcare providers for the Catholic Church in the U.S., I want to say how they provide models of this new evangelization for all of us, educators and healthcare providers alike. And then I'll conclude by suggesting ways that we can incorporate these ideas into our work. So first, what is the new evangelization? So in the preparatory document for the Synod 2 years ago, we read, and I quote, "We are living in a particularly significant historic moment of change, of tension, and of a loss of equilibrium and points of reference. It's difficult for us to listen, to transmit an appreciation for the past, and to share values on which to build the future for new generations. In a word, the situation is requiring the Church to consider in an entirely new way how it proclaims and transmits the faith." So that's all a quotation. I don't think that anyone here doubts that we're in a situation of change and tension, if not crisis, both within the Church and in relation to the wider world. And I think it's fair to say that one basic truth emerging from the new evangelization is that both the world and the Church are continual in need of conversion, and that the message of the gospel offers us, in the words of one of the first converts to its message, the words of eternal life. So what I will do here is to try and relate it, as I said, to our own context and to ask how we can be witnesses to the gospel through our profession in a complex world. And if we are called to evangelize, to call ourselves and others to a conversion of mind and heart to the vision of the gospel, we can hardly do better than to model ourselves after women religious whose interior and exterior conversions are a model of living out the gospel message. So, what is the new way of the new evangelization? This has its origins in the papacies, as I've said, of Pope St. John Paul II and following him, Benedict XVI, who recognized this need to reach out to those who have been baptized and don't know their faith, who have drifted away from their faith, or those who don't know their faith. At the heart of this evangelization is witness to the person and message of Jesus Christ, at a time that, in the words of this preparatory document, requires the Church to consider how it proclaims and transmits our faith. And the document outlines 6 sectors in which it sees the world in need of conversion. And these are, first, culture, and in particular, secularized culture. Second, society, which is in flux due to globalization and migration. Third, social communications, which are increasingly international. Fourth, the economy, with its massive scope and inequalities. Fifth, scientific and technological research, which raise issues previously unthought of. All of the new questions that we never knew this was something we'd have to sort through. And finally, our civic and political life. The document argues that in its evangelization, the Church needs to have the boldness to raise the question of God in the midst of these problems and to engage in dialogue with today's world. So this message that the new evangelization preaches is ultimately a personal encounter with Jesus Christ in the Spirit, thereby leading to an experience of his Father and our Father. In this encounter, we're able, and again to quote, to share the Son's relationship with his Father and to experience the power of the Spirit. From this perspective, transmitting the faith in Christ means to create the conditions for a faith which is thought out, celebrated, lived, and prayed. In short, participating in the life of the Church. Okay, that's what we're supposed to do. Well, I think it's clear that many of those we encounter find that participating in the life of the Church, especially in its institutional forms, is precisely the obstacle in one's encounter with Christ. Many do not have any relation to the Church or are not Christian. At Loyola, a little less than half of our students are Catholic. This has actually kind of declined over the last few years. Many have no religious background at all. During a course I taught 2 years ago, my students and I read many texts on conscience, and I continually stressed the need for a thoughtful understanding of positions by engaging the teaching of the Church in conversation with classic and contemporary writers on our topics. So we read about abortion, we read about same-sex marriage, we read about the ordination of women, we read about birth control. It was interesting and gratifying to read student papers on these issues and to hear my students, after researching these issues, come to the stunning realization that church teaching was not irrational. It was actually thoughtfully and carefully argued. Ultimately, though, many of them were not convinced. They pointed to the institutional church's treatment of women religious, of official church teaching opposing same-sex marriage, of the rhetoric of bishops in relation to elections. This was the fall of 2012. In relation to elections as examples of their own disengagement with the church. College students are at an age when openness, honesty, and transparency are key values, and many found institutional church teaching and actions sorely lacking in these qualities. So I agree, we need the new evangelization. There are profound gaps in our students' knowledge and in many Catholics' knowledge of the faith, and that their social and even religious contexts are sometimes just plain vacuous. Students, and I think our patients as well, are searching for meaning in their lives, and I am convinced that we have something very important to offer them. But the new evangelization is a complex process. As these documents stress, we need new ways to reach people and to communicate the transforming vision of the gospel message. The conversion, if this is what we're after, of those whom we teach and care for, as well as our own, is a process that demands honesty and integrity. Now, there are many documents related to this whole movement, the new evangelization. Papal speeches, Vatican statements, various responses given by theologians and popular writers, articles by bishops, and they have some common themes. Much of this literature is critical of the old ways of catechesis, such as one bishop's contrast of his preparation for confirmation as memorization with current practice. We read of the need to reanimate a living sense of the gospel, for a reproposing of the gospel to those who are convinced they already know the faith and it holds no interest for them, or to present others with a powerful, credible narrative, and for a more nuanced conversation about the relationship between faith and reason. What has been done really is no longer adequate, and Catholics are urged to consider how best one can proclaim the gospel, since we are all evangelizers. I think that's another message that comes through. This is not just from the teaching office. It's really everyone. Now, I look at something like the social media work of Father James Martin of the Jesuits as one innovative way of reaching people. I've encouraged my students this semester to friend Father Martin and get his updates. If one is more intellectually inclined, turn to the work of Bernard Lonergan, who wrote that the old foundations will no longer do. One must not patch an old cloak with new cloth or put new wine in old wineskins. And a further point that is stressed throughout the literature of the new evangelization is the importance of witness. Repeatedly, popes, bishops, theologians, and popular writers emphasize that one cannot overemphasize the importance of the example of those who live out the faith in integrity. Modern people, the preparatory document says, listen more willingly to witnesses than to teachers, and if they do listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. A Notre Dame theologian remarks on the power of narratives and how stories of personal engagement stir up imaginations and demand a response. So my own students have had, for example, for their first book to read as they came to school, Father Greg Boyle's book, Tattoos on the Heart. And so it's one way of having someone who is a real witness to this. But what I see coming out of the language of the new evangelization is saying, we need something, but I haven't seen it come from these official places in the kind of compelling ways that one would wish to see. So I want to turn to the work of a philosopher of religion, a man named Richard Kearney, for some insights into the fragile condition of faith in a postmodern world. And this particular philosopher's effort is to forge what he calls a third way beyond the extremes of dogmatic theism and militant atheism, those two polar opposites of certainty that have maimed so many minds and souls in our memory. And I think his approach might provide a helpful model for the new evangelization. We are in a situation, he says, that calls for a much more adequate approach to faith, an approach that recognizes the failures of other methods and that knows the emptiness of easy answers. So I want to be clear that I am not suggesting that I find the Catholic tradition to exemplify only what Carney calls the dogmatics of the extremes of dogmatic atheism. Certainly at times it has done so, but as a theologian, I know there are far too many riches in the tradition for it to be so mischaracterized. Rather, I find Carney's reflections to be suggestive of potentially new and imaginative directions for evangelization, so I don't take him as a blueprint, but rather as inspiration. His work is, in a sense, about conversion, although not at all in the language used by official church bodies. So I ask you to bear with me as I try to suggest how his ideas can give us some inspiration. So let me just note, many people, as I've already said, say something went wrong in our catechesis over the last however many years, especially since Vatican II. There's plenty of literature that tries to identify what went wrong, such as various doctrinal deficiencies that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has identified. Some find fault with Vatican II, and still others, what has sometimes been referred to as the culture of narcissism. The list could go on and on. But I think it's clear that there is such a crisis, and we all encounter not only our students, as I do, but people from all walks of life who have little to no religious literacy, and what's worse, they don't see it as a problem. This is not an issue. But when people find themselves in crisis situations, as they do in our healthcare institutions, we have an opportunity to meet them where they are and to be messengers of the good news. Now, for Richard Carney, dogmatic theism and militant atheism are not options as far as he's concerned. So he wonders, is it possible to retrieve a sense of the wonder and newness of an encounter with the divine? And while he doesn't include what I would call a vague indifferentism as a further option, I think his comments are worth considering. His entry into his own third possibility is through his development of the idea of the uninvited guest. This is going to be a theme that he comes back to over and over again, so that we all encounter, in a sense, the uninvited guest, be this our student, our patient, our supervisor, whoever it is. He sees this as a common theme to the three Abrahamic religions, and his term, it comes from the title of his book, Anatheism, A-N-A, which is the way in which we can talk about coming back to. So it is, as he suggests, about repetition and return in what he calls a primordial wager, the option of retrieved belief. So this wager on relating with the uninvited guest is how one responds to this encounter with hospitality or with hostility. And this wager, he says, needs to be constantly renewed. Carney describes the wagers of Abraham, who responded to God's call, get up, leave your country, go where you don't know where you're going, of Mary, and of the prophet Muhammad as they encountered the stranger. And he has a wonderful description of Mary. At the moment of the Annunciation, he says, her wager is to choose grace over fear. She dares imagine the impossible as possible. She says yes. The point that Carney stresses is that we are called to respond to the invitation of the unexpected, the uninvited guest, the one who will not be domesticated or captured or ignored. So there are 5 moments in this wager of response to the uninvited guest, and I'm going to go through each one of these with a little bit of detail here. And these 5 steps are, first, this is where the PowerPoint would help, but you'll just have to bear with me. First is imagination. The second is humor. The third, commitment. The fourth, discernment. And the fifth is hospitality. So those are, again, imagination, humor, commitment, discernment, and hospitality.